What we have done in order to maintain governments which we perceive to be stable and friendly towards the United States, what we have done is to maintain in power governments which are very narrowly based, representative of a very small portion of the population, the landowning elite, and governments which met all demands for social and political change with violence against their opposition.
Nicaragua, 1927. Central America saw the smoke of civil war arise in their tropical skies. The United States cast worried eyes toward Nicaragua. President Coolidge sent peace forces, United States Marines. They stayed 6 years until the people knew order, the jungles knew peace. Who remembers the bandit rebel Sandino?
That's one version of what happened in Nicaragua. Here's another. Cesar Augusto Sandino, originally an officer in the Nicaraguan army, had rebelled against the U.S.-influenced creation of a government friendly to American financial interests. Sandino was considered by fellow Central American rebels of the day, like Mexican Pancho Villa and Salvadoran Farabundo Marti, as something less than a true revolutionary, more as a basic nationalist. Whatever his politics, Sandino was an effective guerrilla leader and enjoyed widespread popular support. For 7 years, he fought against the U.S. Marines and inflicted substantial casualties, despite greater Marine firepower and the advantage of the fledgling U.S. Air Force.
And we must invoke the figure of Sandino in order to recall two things. First, that Mexico was denounced in 1927 by President Calvin Coolidge before a joint session of Congress as the source of Bolshevik subversion in Central America for its support of Sandino. And second, that Sandino, fighting only with machetes and rifles, managed to pin down the United States Marines for 6 years. I wish to recall this because if the United States thinks through its policies towards Nicaragua and its actions in Nicaragua, it should recall that if in 1927 Sandino was able to drown them in a virtual swamp, what would happen today with the more highly armed and efficient Sandinistas? It is a Vietnam of colossal proportions that is being prepared if the United States intervenes militarily in today's Nicaragua.
The Americans in the 30s, reluctant to commit U.S. troops to a long-term policing role, began an intensive program to train a Nicaraguan National Guard. The logic of the National Guard program was to encourage governments to protect themselves and American financial interests with what amounted to private armies. The commander of the Nicaraguan National Guard, Anastasio Somoza. After the U.S. Marines pulled out of Nicaragua, a truce was arranged with Sandino, and for a while at least, it seemed the bitter rivalries had been put aside in the interests of national unity. But shortly after this chummy picture of Somoza and Sandino was taken, Somoza ordered his soldiers to murder Sandino. 2 years later, Somoza emerged as the victor of an 8-day civil war and installed himself as president. The Somoza family was to rule Nicaragua for the next 43 years. The Depression hit Central America just as hard as it did North America. Harder, in fact, because most Central Americans were already living at a bare subsistence level. When farm workers' salaries were cut in half by the sudden collapse of the banana and coffee markets, workers became desperate and protest movements flourished. In El Salvador, Farabundo Marti, a fervent middle-class communist, roused the peasant majority to rise against the military dictatorship of General Maximiliano Hernandez. The revolution lasted only a few days. The well-equipped army easily defeated the machete-wielding peasants. As a sort of preemptive strike at any recurring unrest, the army slaughtered as many as 30,000 Salvadorans, Farabundo Marti among them. The United States immediately widened diplomatic relations with the Hernandez regime because, as the State Department concluded, the dictator had proven himself capable of maintaining order and ensuring the protection of American interests. 1933, a new U.S. president with a new set of ideas. Although Franklin Roosevelt was preoccupied with his New Deal reform policies designed to pull the U.S. out of the Depression, he also had a plan to set up a new relationship with Latin America, his Good Neighbor policy.
In the field of world policy, I would dedicate this nation to the policy of the good neighbor, the neighbor who resolutely respects himself and, because he does so, respects the rights of others, the neighbor who respects his obligations and respects the sanctity of agreement in and with a world of neighbor.
Unfortunately, the good neighbor policy turned out to be better in theory than in practice. Under FDR, U.S. interference and intervention in Central America continued. Deals were struck with dictators because it was easier and less expensive to have the armies of the dictatorships maintain the security of the region than to send in the Marines.
The good neighbor policy was also a shift from more direct and overt military intervention to a kind of economic management. Once the United States had secured its economic interests in Central America and the Caribbean in particular, it became possible then to use those economic levers to maintain control, and there was much less need for direct military intervention.
When the United States joined the war in Europe, its Central American neighbors were easily encouraged into involving themselves. As Roosevelt's Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, bragged, the political lineup followed the economic lineup. After the war, following the lead of his predecessors, President Harry Truman moved to consolidate American economic and political investments in Central America by reinforcing the already close military relationships. The United States encouraged the creation of the Organization of American States and a number of other treaties with Latin American governments. Those agreements proscribed interference in the affairs of one state by another, but loopholes were built in, insisted upon by the United States, which allowed U.S. intervention in any member state for the maintenance of peace and security. In effect, Truman was replacing the unilateral policies of Monroe, Roosevelt, and the others with the appearance of a more palatable regional policy. Social unrest, riots, and revolutions swept across Latin America in the late 40s and early 50s. By the end of 1954, military dictatorships ruled 13 of 20 Latin American countries. Some officials in the Truman and Eisenhower administrations were uncomfortable with the excesses of the dictators they were associated with, but the U.S. continued to support them for the purely expedient protection of American interests and the defense the right-wing regimes were believed to provide against the specter of the international communist threat. Guatemala, 1954. The constitutionally elected government of Jacobo Arbenz Guzman began implementing a liberal reform program. Unused agricultural land was expropriated from the big landowners and distributed among the Indian and peasant population. Arbenz legalized the Guatemalan Communist Party and allowed the formation of a peasant union, which, as it grew in power, alarmed the landowners, the army, and the right-wing Catholic Church, not to mention the United Fruit Company. David Atlee Phillips was the CIA's man in Guatemala in 1954.
The Cold War was at its height, and President Eisenhower decided he simply didn't want to have that going on down there. So at his request, there was a CIA operation to assist some rebels. It was largely a psychological warfare type operation.
The CIA chose a disaffected Guatemalan Army colonel, Carlos Castillo Armas, to lead the uprising. He led a fighting force of fewer than 200 men, but the CIA, with false radio broadcasts and other psychological warfare techniques, convinced Guatemalans that Castillo Armas was about to capture the capital.
The president of that government, Jacobo Arbenz, suddenly announced that he was going to step down. And he went into asylum in the Mexican embassy. And it was over. Eisenhower was terribly, terribly pleased.
So was the United Fruit Company, as G.B. Wright, vice president of what is now United Brands, recollects.
And I think they regarded it generally as, certainly as an unfriendly and a dangerous government for our presence in Guatemala, and perhaps for the Guatemalan people.
It was hailed at the time as a glorious victory for democracy by John Foster Dulles. We see today what the interruption of the internal political process in Guatemala meant. Guatemala was condemned to hell by the United States.
When we return, trying to apply the Guatemalan model in the 60s and 70s.
A sales executive leads a full life after open-heart surgery. A 13-year-old girl survives third-degree burns. A hemophiliac pursues a career as an artist. Success stories that come from the miracle of modern medicine and your blood. Somewhere, right now, someone is waiting. Take a few minutes to give this precious gift. Visit your nearest Red Cross blood donor clinic.
One of these men is a king, married to a beautiful queen.
But which is it, Papa? There are two of them.
And both have wives.
Wives, now this complicates matters.
Only Nurse knows who's who.
Is he the king?
Or this my brother? Gilbert and Sullivan's The Gondoliers, adapted for television by Norman Campbell from Brian McDonald's Stratford production. A CBC television special presentation, Sunday. Two people with their own dreams. Together they made them happen. A love story. Chautauqua Girl, a movie special, coming Sunday, January 8th.
We hope you found us entertaining this year.
And helpful and informative, too.
Thanks for being with us, and have a very happy Christmas.
And may you have all you wish for in 1984.
I wish I had hair just like this. Look at it.
You
It's
can.
that's a wig.